As contract farming agreements become more complex and costs keep rising, what can contract farmers do to ensure longevity?
As you allude, contract farming agreements, they're under significant pressure, and they've been under pressure for a number of years now. So, off the back of the invasion of the Ukraine, we've had sort of 3 years where we've seen a sort of fall in commodity values, and then we've had low yields, which has compounded issues. But during that period, there's obviously been rising labour and machinery costs and things that have gone alongside that, which is hence why contractors' charges have gone up. So from a farmer's perspective, it's making sure that the agreement is correctly structured. And that's just making sure that there's an appropriate balance between risk and reward, making sure that the contractor is rewarded appropriately for the service they're delivering, but that there's a sufficient carrot for them to aim for, to be able to strive to go over and beyond. Because the reality is that if you're not hitting a divisible surplus, which is what we're seeing in agreements over the last few years, then that's demotivating for the contractor. So it has to be a bit of balance, and obviously agreements are now more complicated than they were because they have environmental schemes and things which all form part of the consideration. So from a farmer's perspective, it's making sure that the agreement is geared for what's going on in front of them, and that's having an element of flexibility to how the agreements are set up. The first thing to say is environmental schemes are reshaping how contract farming agreements are set up, and it's altering land use. And ultimately, when commodity values are low and you've got issues with unpredictable weather and poor yield, what you're tending to find is people are trying to elect for options which are low risk. And ultimately, utilising environmental options, whilst there is a whole raft of reasons why people might want to be engaging with that, the truth is that it provides stable income. And I guess the challenge is like, how do we structure contract farming agreements so that this environmental money can be incorporated? And I think that in absolute transparency, no one agreement is structured in the same way. So what we're tending to see is altering contractors' charges for delivering environmental services, and sort of stab in the dark as a starting place is generally that they're about 50% of the full contractor's charge. But also there is a bit of drawing of boundaries as to what is included and what isn't included. And I think from our perspective, we would tend to be looking at stuff that affects the centre of the field. If it affects the centre of the field, then the money should be included in the contract farming agreement. If it's stuff around the outside, then maybe you might be dealing with it in a slightly different fashion, might be paid by operation with all the money going to the farmer, and you handle it differently. So I think it's a case of, what I mentioned earlier on about the fact that we need to dangle a suitable carrot in our contractor's charge, in our divisible surplus calculation. I think that there also has to be recognition that is for delivery of skill, and growing a pollen and nectar mix might not require the same level of skill as it requires to grow an extra ton of wheat. And I think that it's making sure that the contract farming agreement has the flexibility to allow for that. Now, it might be that if you're a farmer that's really motivated by the environment, you might be saying, well, that's a really good pollen and nectar mix, and I will, I'll pay you over and beyond because of the environmental delivery. But the practical nuts and bolts of, delivery for what you've done, it tends to be on a lesser basis for the environmental areas. What are the emerging trends? Well, I think the answer is that we're not seeing any sort of reduction in contractors' charges. In fact, as I've alluded earlier on, contractors' charges are continuing to rise year on year. And the minimum wage will go up again in April next year. So once again, we will be, anticipating that contractors will be coming back to the fore and saying that they need to put charges up. So we are seeing a general softening of farmers' retentions. I think that's just the adjustment, the seesaw effect of just kind of balancing that out. And in some cases, we're just seeing a bit of adjustment in how the balance of the divisible surplus is calculated in order to perhaps manipulate things further if so required. year on year, we are seeing an increase in area being offered up for environmental schemes. And I think that that's in part has been part of the risk management strategy that farms have undertaken over the last few years. I think gone on farms that we're involved with, it's gone from being sort of 5 to 7% of the total farmed area to being over 15%. So we've got the next round of the SFI coming out later this year. Lots of people will have SFI agreements that are coming to an end, and therefore there will be a natural junction that comes to that, which we'll see how things might change from there. When we look at Harvest 2024, the performance from contract farming agreements has been lower than 2023, which have been lower than 2022. Our forecast for 2025 suggests a further sort of tempering on results, and I think that is undoubtedly a consequence of what has been a pretty poor harvest in terms of yield, and commodity values that would be comparatively low to if you sort of allowed for inflation from 20 years ago. But when you look at our budgets for 2026, we're showing that we're expecting things to pick up. Now that's probably an element that we're ever the optimist, and we're hopeful that things are going to improve. I think that undoubtedly we've had a kinder autumn, which has set things up. But yeah, I think like the biggest thing on the horizon from our perspective is making sure that we market grain well for Harvest 2026, because the reality is that 2025 has been pretty disappointing, and that forward selling has been really, really important in terms of helping businesses that we're involved with reach budget. But also it's a bit of a case that it's a known in terms of how how we position our sales at this point in time. And if everyone's got good plantings in the ground in the autumn, it's likely that there's going to be a plentiful harvest. And if there's going to be a plentiful harvest, that means that there's going to be good supply, which is going to keep things depressed. So yeah, from an advisory perspective, we're really seeing it that the things over the last few years have been about risk management, and the next step on risk management from our perspective is probably just making sure that we get grain sold at the right time in the next 12 months, because if we don't do something now, it might slip between our fingers and we'll be in the same position as we are currently. Yeah, so I think that there's sort of two parts to this question, really. In the first instance, historically, economies of scale has always been the thing that's kind of been the driver from a contractor's perspective. It enables you to help spread your costs. And I think that in an environment where there has been profit available through contract farming agreements, it's been very sensible and prudent to kind of expand. But as we look at things at the moment, machinery is replacement is very, very expensive, labour is very, very expensive, and perhaps that economies of scale is slightly being challenged. And therefore, if you're running multiple agreements, you've always got the benefit that if you're involved with multiple agreements, that you've got a bigger pot to play with. So you've got more yields, you've got more chances to kind of sell things at the right time, and you have lesser percentages of the crops which are more variable in their performance in the grand scheme of things. The problem is, if you ain't making any money, then you're losing money hand over fist from all sides and all angles. So I think that our advice to those that are sort of large contract farmers is making sure that they really know what their costs are. And I think that the example that I most readily would offer in terms of where the multiple contract farming businesses sort of are at play is that I have seen throughout my career opportunities where contractors have lost land, or there's been cause for them to lose land, and they've ended up making more money at the end of it because they haven't been burdened with the additional overheads of trying to run a larger area. So that's why I say it isn't always just a case that economies of scale equals profit, but equally it does help manage risk.